But I'll tell you, when we talk about the grief journey at that point, for a while, I was very adamant in the fact that I was not going to grieve my daughter while she was still alive. I would have told anybody who asked that I would not grieve my daughter while I was looking at her. And then what happened was, somewhere along the way, I was asked to speak on a panel about ambiguous grief. And if anybody invites me to do anything related to ultra rare diseases or grief, I always say yes because I like to raise awareness. And so I said, of course, I'll speak on the panel. And then I hung up the phone and I went to Google ambiguous grief. I had never heard of it before.
Hello, and welcome to Grief, Gratitude, and the Gray in Between podcast. This podcast is about exploring the grief that occurs at different times in our lives, in which we have had major changes and transitions that literally shake us to the core and make us experience grief. I created this podcast for people to feel a little less hopeless and alone in their own grief process as they hear the stories of others who have had similar journeys. I'm Kendra Rinaldi, your host. Now, let's dive right into today's episode. On today's podcast, I have Jessica Fein. She is the author of InBreath Taking, a memoir of family, dreams, and broken genes. And she is the host of I Don't Know How You Do It podcast. And we will be chatting today primarily about her grief journey with the passing of her daughter, Dahlia. And I'm excited to have this conversation with you. So welcome, Jessica.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I'm glad you are here. I know that having a podcast on the topic of grief and talking about grief might have not been in your plans at all some years back. But since 2022 was the passing of your daughter, Dahlia, and I know you have other grief journeys to share as well, your life has kind of shifted. So, if you don't mind sharing with us a little more about you and what your life looked like prior to becoming a mom.
Sure. I will say you're right. I have such a complex grief journey. I have lost three parents, my two siblings, and my teenage daughter. So I was really introduced to grief at such a profound way when I was 27, and my 30-year-old sister died suddenly. And I know you asked what did my life look like before my daughter died, but I will say before my sister died is where I was living in a bit of a bubble. And when she died, she was my best friend. It was like that bubble was punctured. And I saw the world so differently because I saw it through that puncture. And that really changed me because it was like, oh God, the reality that anything can happen at any time. But fast forward, before my daughter, my husband and I had a pretty long road to becoming parents. We had 5 years of fertility treatments, very creative kinds of fertility treatments, started off kind of standard and went more and more complicated. But ultimately, we changed directions and decided to adopt. And we adopted three children from Guatemala. And we thought the tough part was over. Little did we know that our middle daughter had a really insidious degenerative disease. She was diagnosed at age 5 with MERF syndrome, which stands for myoclonic epilepsy ragged red fibers. It's an ultra rare disease. And our lives took a lot of twists and turns from there until she died at age 17.
Wow. The part that I read when you said about your life being punctured, I actually had like kind of highlighted that part. Let me see of your book or quoted how you mentioned that there were many more losses to come, each one shaped by the first. I started to see the world not through my hazy, I don't understand my own writing. But through the not through the hazy blur of the bubble, but through the puncture. And just how life perspective just completely shifts with those type of situations. And like you said, it just kind of built up on that. Now, at the age of 5, Dahlia's 5, you've adopted. She was just 2 weeks old when you adopted her. Is that correct? Is that
No, she
no?
was
How old?
actually, she was 2
Oh,
weeks
2 months.
old, excuse me, when we found out about her,
Oh,
but
okay,
we weren't
okay,
allowed to bring her back until she was 6 months. So
okay.
we brought her back at 6 months.
At 6 months, so 2 weeks when you found out about her, and then so when you find out then at the age of 5 of her diagnosis, let's talk about that impact and the journey of grief that goes into finding out that the idea of what your family is going to look like is not, because you had to deal already with that situation earlier. You go through in vitro, you go through losses of of
Absolutely.
not going for you had a surrogate, you had all these different things, and you go through those losses every time. The idea again, your idea of your life is shifting, right? Of what it was going to look like. Okay, shift again. Oh, shift again. And
Exactly.
yeah, and you mentioned
Exactly.
something in your book like what you can make a plan and God laughs, right? I've just read parts of your book. God laughs, and it's true. You make a plan. Oh, that nope,
Yeah.
shift again. So here you are. She's 5. Tell
Yeah.
us how you found out and that journey.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I always kind of suspected something was off developmentally. And I would, try to get doctors and early intervention and specialists and professionals to pay attention. But my concerns were largely dismissed, and you start to think like, oh, I'm just being one of those parents. But ultimately, at age 4, she was diagnosed with a hearing loss. And it's funny because at the time I was like, "Oh my god, hearing loss." Like, it seemed like such a big deal, and in retrospect, it turned out to be such a blip compared to what would happen. But because we didn't know why she had hearing loss, we were sent for genetic testing. And that's when this disease was discovered. And I will say at first, more than grief, there was confusion with the diagnosis on so many levels. I mean, first of all, there was the scientific confusion. We didn't understand what it all meant. The doctors didn't have much data to go on because it's an ultra rare disease. And Dahlia was doing great. I mean, yeah, she had some developmental issues, but she was in a mainstream school and she was running and jumping and giggling. And, she was just fabulous. So it didn't make much sense. And for the next 4 years, while some of her symptoms became more pronounced, things more or less were quote unquote normal. One of my least favorite words, but so be it. And then when she was 9, we went on a family trip. And while we were on vacation, she caught a cold. And that cold quickly spiraled, turned into pneumonia, and landed us in the ICU where she was intubated. And we ultimately, after a very complicated battle with an insurance company, ended up back in our home turf in the Boston area, but she couldn't leave the hospital and we all moved in for 3 months. And she, at that point at age 9, had a tracheotomy. So, for people who might not know, that's when you have a little hole in your neck with a tube and you breathe through that. She lost at that point her ability to walk and to talk, to eat, and she became ventilator dependent. So, now what that meant was that she was what's called an eyes on patient, meaning myself or my husband or a nurse trained specifically in her care had to have our eyes on her 24/7. And then things changed dramatically. But still, she was just wanting to have fun and be a kid and all the things that kids do. She just didn't want to give in to her own grief, and therefore we didn't allow ourselves to give into ours. But I'll tell you, when we talk about the grief journey at that point, for a while, I was very adamant in the fact that I was not going to grieve my daughter while she was still alive. I would have told anybody who asked that I would not grieve my daughter while I was looking at her. And then what happened was somewhere along the way, I was asked to speak on a panel about ambiguous grief. And if anybody invites me to do anything related to ultra rare diseases or grief, I always say yes because I like to raise awareness. And so I said, of course, I'll speak on the panel. And then I hung up the phone and I went to Google ambiguous grief. I had never heard of it before. And when I learned that this was a real thing and that we could grieve somebody who was still alive and that that wasn't disloyal and there was a name for it, it was so powerful because now I understood that it was okay to acknowledge these feelings of loss, to acknowledge that our life looked so different from what we had imagined, to acknowledge that we wouldn't hear our daughter's voice again, to acknowledge all of the losses along the way. And so I was so grateful to understand that not all kinds of grief come with a Hallmark card. There are many, many other kinds of grief.
It's so important what you just said of the awareness and knowledge of all the different types of grief that there are. Because, like you said, when you don't have that understanding, you feel a little lost and even, like you said, even guilty of starting to grieve someone if she's still like, "You're
Mhm.
here." Like, no, I'm so grateful that you're alive and that you're here, yet there's still this grief that again, like you said, that life does not look like what you thought it was going to look like. Your son didn't have a daughter, sister to play with in the same way anymore, right? There's certain things that shifted. So thank you for sharing about your journey with ambiguous grief. Now, how was it then in that moment of as her health is deteriorating, that as parents, you and Rob helped you only had JoJo at that
Nope,
time?
we had Jojo and Theo. Dahlia
And
was our
Theo,
middle.
middle. So Theo was already in your lives at that time. How did you help the 2 of them also navigate their grief in that experience?
Not well. So thank you for asking me because this is one of my biggest learnings. And I credit JoJo for helping me learn this because what happened was, as things got more intense, Rob and I decided, without ever discussing it, just kind of intuitively, that we were going to what we perceived to be shouldering the burden. We didn't want to put anything else on our other kids. And so we thought, we'll carry the worry and the angst and the pain and all of that, and we won't put it on them. And so we, without again agreeing to it, put on a bit of a strong front. And we, we included Dahlia in everything we did. And we, were very, very much a family of five. And we didn't talk very openly about what was happening. And one night, Rob and I were already in bed, and JoJo came into the room and was sobbing
How
and
old
said,
was he at that time? How old?
um, let me do some math.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. It's like if
A
your brain
teenager, a young
okay.
teenager, and said, there's something wrong with me. And we said, what are you talking about? What do you mean? And JoJo said, I'm so scared and I'm so angry and I pray and I pray and I pray and Dahlia's not getting any better. But you two are fine. What's wrong with me? And it was like one of those aha moments. A lot of aha moments aren't actually moments. It takes years for them to sink in. But this was a like, oh my God, we have allowed Jojo to think, and probably Theo too, that something was wrong with them for feeling all of these really legitimate, genuine feelings. And it's such an important thing that, I mean, I wish Jojo didn't have to point it out to us, but once Jojo did, I've become so much more open with both of them about everything, about even today, about stress or anxiety, anything I'm going through, to let them know that, we all have these feelings and it's okay and we can talk about it and acknowledge it. But I needed to be shown that in a really hit me over the head kind of way.
You hit the nail on the head, as they say. It's like as parents, we're always trying to protect our children, yet sometimes what we do that we think that we're protecting them ends up sometimes not being the right move. Again, We don't have a manual. We don't know
Right.
what, you know what I mean?
Right,
We
and I
learn as
try
we
to have
go.
compassion for where we were
Of
coming from. I know we
course.
thought we were doing right, but
We
we
all
learned.
Yeah, we always do. We really are doing the best, with what we have and the knowledge we have. And that awareness of being able to then, well, when he brought it to your attention, to be able to validate his emotions by he himself seeing your vulnerability as well as parents and seeing what you guys were going through, then it would make him feel like, okay, I am not crazy for
Right.
feeling this way, to validate somebody else. So the whole thing of like, oh, be strong, these things that people say, be strong, or when
No,
somebody dies and that
no.
the first thing somebody says, be strong. Ah,
I
it
can't
drives me
stand it, and I get
crazy.
it all the time. People will say to me, "Oh, you're so strong." And I know people are just trying to, be kind or show respect, but what they don't realize is when you tell somebody they're so strong, they then feel like they can't show you any vulnerability.
Yeah, no, yeah, it's one of the things like, yeah, we think we put strong as if it's
Mhm.
like a big, uh, virtue type of thing
Yes.
when it could just be right alongside vulnerability. I actually think vulnerability is way higher up than
Yeah,
that because you're really being real of what it is you're experiencing, while being strong is sometimes putting up a front, a face,
exactly.
it's a way, a mechanism of not getting hurt. So yeah, so anyway, I'm glad that he pointed that out to you guys, and that shifted then that dynamic a little bit with them. So then you at 9, you're going through this. How did you said one of you guys had to be with her during that time. So did your work dynamics then change in that moment too? And how did that also
Yeah,
affect
well,
the
it's such
whole
a good
process?
question. So, my husband and I continued to each work full time out of the house the entire time. We were fortunate that the state of Massachusetts gave us 100 or so nursing hours a week. The problem, of course, is that there's a nursing shortage and we often couldn't fill those hours. But we did have that help. So we had a trained nurse go with Dahlia to school every day. She went to school all the way through. And during the time that she was at school, I was able to go to work and my husband was able to go to work. And, it's an interesting one because there was definitely some judgment put on me for continuing to work. There was never any judgment put on my husband. And it's interesting because I was the primary breadwinner. And yet the expectation was that I, as the mom, should be home with my daughter, who, P.S., wasn't even home. She was at school. But I did have, look, there were so many people who were privy to our situation in terms of professionals, doctors and nurses and therapists. And, everybody has an opinion. But for me, I know that I was a better caregiver, a better parent because I was working. It allowed me to have my own identity. It allowed me to have a break from a really intense, scary situation and allowed me to do a job that I knew I was good at. Sometimes at home I wasn't so sure, but at work I knew what I was doing.
Right. That's so good that you just mentioned that, because you had a place in which you could feel some elements of success and kind of fuel you and feed you, right? So that in these
Yes,
other moments in which you said you do not know what you're doing and that the uncertainty is there, right? While in
exactly.
your work, you could be like, I know if I answer this many phone calls or
Yeah,
write these many emails, I still, there's a certainty
exactly.
here, there's an uncertainty here. I need this. And the part of judgment, because we get judgment throughout, right, in general, but yet we also sometimes judge ourselves and go through that guilt component of like, oh, should I have spent this much time at doing this and not this, those kind of things. So how did you juggle then all this noise from the outside world as well as your own mental conversations, the drunken monkey in your head?
Right. I think a few ways. First of all, I was so fortunate that my husband and I worked together beautifully as partners in this really intense situation. And I will say as well, because the assumption from the outside is that mom is the more hands on caregiver. And in our partnership relationship, my husband was a much better hands-on caregiver than I was. And that's not to put myself down unnecessarily, but it's to say he was exceptional. And there was very highly skilled medical care involved in a day-to-day basis, and he mastered it. And I could do it and did do it, obviously, but he was just better at it. And he was also so patient and so loving to her, and their relationship was so spiritual and beautiful. So having each other to kind of pick up slack was a big one. And having those people in my life who have been in my life for so many years. I have friends I've been friends with since first grade, and people who really understood me. They did not understand the situation because nobody could understand that really if you weren't living in this house. But, they are a good reality check too.
Tell us about your circle then of community.
Yeah.
Because had they
You know,
been there for these other losses, or is it people that you
yes.
started kind of
No.
adding to your life? Yeah,
I am so fortunate. I have a lot of very close girlfriends who I've been friends with. Like my newest close girlfriend, I've been friends with only for 20 years. Everybody else, it's like, elementary school,
only 20 years.
yeah, high school. And so they're in many ways the keeper of my history. I mean, when you lose so many people in your life, it's so important to have others who knew the main characters. And that's why I'm always like, it's hard to meet people now. There's just way too much to catch them up on. So I was really fortunate that I've kind of gathered people along the way. And once you're in my inner circle, I kind of don't let you go.
I love what you just said that they're the keepers of your history because I interviewed somebody that in the film that which is called Meet Me Where I Am, a film that's out. There was one of the people that he's interviewing, a documentarist says that every relationship we have, there those two people are the only ones that know what's happened. So for example, you and know me. My sister also died. My sister was 2 years younger than I am. So that dynamic that happens between, let's say, two
Yeah.
siblings, the memories you have together when that person dies, the viewpoint of how even that person saw you is also gone. So that sliver of identity is also gone. So in all these interactions that you've had, each one of these, the ones 20 years, the ones 30, I don't know your age, so I don't want to keep on going with more because I know I,
I'm
you
like,
know,
keep going, keep going. Yeah.
that, um, each one of your interactions is a unique dynamic in itself as well. So, how each one chooses to support you in your grief is also unique.
Absolutely. And some people were much better at it than others. And here's the thing, people are uncomfortable and awkward and weird about grief. And it makes no sense because, as grief is universal, right? Every single person is going to experience grief. It's like the most universal thing there is. And it ought to be the strongest connective tissue we have. And instead, people run in the other direction. They don't know what to say. So they don't say anything at all. Or they say, empty pablum kind of things. And look, not everybody, some people really understand what it means to sit with somebody in their pain, to continue to show up over time, to be there in those more meaningful ways. But it's hard and it's awkward, and we don't like to be uncomfortable. So we avoid it.
Yeah, and it's not like consciously, it's subconsciously our mind is there to protect us from
Right.
discomfort. It just does it. And so we kind of have to override that in order to really be able to sit with someone that's going through grief. And so when you say, sit with someone going through grief and be with someone, share with us some of these ways in which people showed up for you after Dahlia's passing, which is
Yeah,
just,
sure. I'd be
so,
happy
so
to
recent.
because
Yeah.
I think it's just so important. And I'm actually, I have a TED talk I'm about to do on this very topic because I do feel like it's something that is learnable. And look, I was totally awkward and weird about grief before I was personally had experienced it. I mean, I have examples of that, but that wasn't your question. But some of the things people did is number one, don't assume that we're either going to get over it or that we want to get over it. I don't want to get over any of my grief because it is a part of who I am. Those people are a part of who I am. So understanding that this is a process and that I am going to learn to integrate their losses, not to get over them, I think is a huge one. I love it when people send me pictures or videos even still, when I get them of people in my life who have died a long time ago, because when you lose somebody, you don't have the chance to make any new memories with that person. So when somebody shares something with you, now you have a new memory you can add to your memory bank. And that's so meaningful. Another thing is when I tell somebody that I've lost my daughter and they say, "What was her name?" And they open a conversation instead of saying, "Oh, I can't imagine," which shuts down a conversation right away. The most beautiful thing anybody did, which is really exceptional. So I'm not suggesting that, this would make sense for most of us, but the spirit behind it might be something that resonates. My husband had a colleague who came to our house. We're Jewish and we sit Shiva for 7 days when somebody dies. And my husband had a colleague who came one day and didn't really come in, was more walking around. We have a very big yard. It was walking around and was just outside the whole time. Well, little did we know he was kind of scoping out the soil because a few weeks later, he showed up with a truck filled with dahlias, the flower. Of course, our daughter was Dahlia, and planted the most beautiful dahlia garden. And it's just been such a tremendous gift for us. And my husband has become really, really into the gardening of it, and it's grown tremendously. And now we have this beautiful gift that stays over time and reminds us so much of our beautiful dahlia.
I know people cannot see me and I would keep myself muted, but you can see me in the reaction. Oh my gosh. That is just, and it's somebody that he worked with. So that's the part sometimes that I've had with conversations with people that sometimes it's people that sometimes weren't even that close to them that show up in a way that just blows their mind. And
Yeah.
like you said, it's like they connect. Now they're really close
Oh,
friends.
so close. And I will never, I mean, not only will I never forget that, we think about it all that my house is
You
filled
see
with
that?
dahlias right now, you know?
Wow. It's
Yeah.
just so beautiful. Now you can never move. Or if not, you're gonna
Oh,
have to
right,
dig up your
exactly. Well, we dig them up each year, so we'll have to bring it with us. But now we've become like I do a weekly newsletter, and one of the things I do is dahlia spotting, and I'm always people are sending me pictures of dahlias that they see in different places. So yeah.
So it's just so unique. Each of us can find a way in which we honor it. Of course, your daughter's name is one that also has
Yes.
the name of a flower. And you chose to change. So her birth name was different. So curious, what made you change to Dahlia? What was
Yeah.
it that
Well, her birth
resonated
name
with
was
her?
Daniela.
Yes.
And I actually really liked that name and we considered keeping it. I thought that was very cute. But to be honest, I had always loved the name Talia. And I had always thought, well, if I ever have a daughter, I'm going to name her Talia. But by the time all these years later, then I knew a lot of baby Talias. And I was like, okay. And then it just
Yeah, you
struck
live in
me.
Boston. You live in
Yeah,
Boston. It's a very common in a Jewish community too.
right.
I've heard a lot of Dahlias. Is that
Yeah.
correct? Yeah.
But then I was like, oh, Dahlia is perfect because the way we spelled it Dalia. All the letters of Dahlia were in Daniela. So I loved that connection. And then her middle name was my sister Nomi's name. So she was Dahlia Nomi.
So even there you're also keeping your
Yes.
sister's memory alive with and put in, and you do that, right? Can
Yes.
you talk about that aspect of tradition and what tradition and your religious traditions, what part has I'm so emotional right now, still from the dahlia planting. Um, how, because then a lot of times you name, but sometimes you don't put the exact name. Sometimes you use the letter. So tell us, what was your choice of wanting to continue that tradition, but actually naming them? Is that correct?
Yes. Well,
Am I
so
correct? I'm
here's
not Jewish, so I'm
no, that's great. I
trying to
love talking
remember.
about it. So, in the Jewish religion, well, if you're Ashkenazi, which I am, you can't name somebody after somebody who's still alive. You only name them for people who have died. And then what some people do is they pick a letter because they might not want it. Like, for example, my mother's name was Zelda. I happen to love the name Zelda. My mother hated it. she was so embarrassed by it, which is so funny because she was such a Zelda. But she always said to us, "You better never ever name anybody after me," because she hated the name Zelda. So we took the Z and we gave my youngest son's middle name is Zev for Zelda. So people will do things like that. For my eldest, we chose the name Jonah because my I had a grandfather who was Yena, which is the Yiddish way you would say Jonah, and then my sister Nomi, her middle name was Yona, which is the Hebrew word. So we kept it. We just turned it into English. So yeah, so that's how you do it, and it's a beautiful tradition because you keep those names, and then of course my husband's. His father was Jim, and he was not Jewish. He converted. So his father was Jim and his brother was Jim, which I know a lot of people do. They'll name after somebody who's alive. And I'm always like, my God, that must be confusing. Like when somebody calls the house and they're like, is Jim there? Or.
Yeah, the junior, because
Yeah.
that's yeah,
And of course, now we have cell phones. So I'm dating myself. But, that was like
yeah.
when they were growing up.
So then here, then you have the Nomi, then for Dahlia's middle name, and
Yeah.
so you know that part of, like you said, you like hearing people ask your daughter's name and hearing their name
Yeah.
because that's something you do. So you also then continue that with Dahlia, Nomi. You
Right.
still just
Yeah, and it's interesting. I've spoken with a couple people lately who do this thing where they will order coffee under the
I've heard
name
that.
of the person they've lost so that they hear their name kind of shouted out in the Starbucks or wherever. I always thought that was kind of interesting.
I love that. I love that. I'm gonna do that another time because I
Yeah.
have not done that with my sister or my mom. I'm gonna do that because I like that
What
tradition.
was your sister's name?
Zorana, so with the Z,
Oh,
Zorana.
that's
Yeah,
beautiful.
Zorana, yeah, and then, my mom and Edia, Enid, but I will do that, but then it's interesting because sometimes too, the spelling of people's
Yeah.
na when you're saying it, they might write it differently, but
Yeah.
if when they're saying it out, at least you're hearing it again, so then, yeah,
Yeah.
that would be nice. Okay, so community traditions, then you have that tradition. Sit and Shiva, that was another tradition that also helped in your grief. What other tools that you use? Did you go to therapy as an individual, as a family? Did you just choose to do your own grief
Yeah.
journey? Please share your mourning process, please.
Yeah. And so we did not go to therapy as a family. And I will say one of the things that I learned with my first loss is how, even when you lose the same person with the same relationship, it's so individual. Like when my sister Rachel and I lost Nomi, we both lost our sister. And yet it was a totally different loss because she meant something so different to both of us. Um, so, likewise, in our family, we've each grieved in a very different way. And the most, the thing that I'm most conscious of as a parent is to try to make sure that my kids understand that I'm always open for talking to them and that they don't need to take care of me. And the reason why is that when my sister died, I was 27, and I'll never forget one of my mom's friends came to me and said, "You need to take care of your mother. Losing a child is the worst thing that can happen to somebody." And I was like, "What? What do you mean I need to take care of my mother? Isn't my mother going to be taking care of me?" Like, I just didn't even get it. I felt so at sea without my sister. I had never lived a day in my life without her. And now I was being told that my loss was lesser than, right? And I do think that siblings are often overlooked. We only had one person who sent something to each of our kids as individual packages, like a cozy throw or whatever it was. And meanwhile, as parents, the community descends and you do get a lot of attention, at least initially. And I think siblings are often overlooked. And so I do try to make sure that my children know how much I recognize their loss. And I'll even tell them I lost my siblings because I then lost my other sister as well, so that they know that. For me, of course, writing has been a big, big, big thing. I wrote the book while Dahlia was still alive, but I also do write a lot of essays now. I have a column in Psychology Today on grief called Grace in Grief, and I write essays in a number of places as well. But just writing all along has been very useful for me to process and to gain some control over the narrative. And so that's been really important for me in my grieving process.
And what have you noticed has been something that's helped boys and in their grief for you than writing? What has been something that's helped their journey?
I think for my little guy, he's been able to I call him my little guy, he's now 17, just to be clear.
I have a 17-year-old and
Okay.
yes, he's taller than me and he's
Yeah,
still I
I
told
know,
him yesterday when I was picking him up from school, I said, "You know, when I see you, like, I know you're really big, but I still see you as this little
yes,
kid."
totally. So for him, he's become really, really into fishing, and I know that going out there on his own and spending time outside in nature and being away from like all of the like energy of being a high school senior with tons of friends and being on sports, but just going out into nature and fishing and having that time alone, I think is really, really important. And for our eldest, therapy has been more useful. And I think also um, giving back. So Jojo became an EMT after Dahlia died. Isn't practicing as an EMT right now, but I think just having that experience and feeling like maybe there was an opportunity to help some other people who were in emergency situations. And for my husband, I'm telling you, that Dahlia garden, that does wonders.
That's his space of being able to
Yeah.
nurture those dahlias just like he
Yeah.
nurtured his daughter. Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. And I will say I love talking about this stuff because it does make me feel close to my family. But he would, I mean, this would be like his biggest nightmare if he had to do this.
Yeah, not everybody and that's the thing, like, you have a podcast as well, and so do I. Like, not everybody has to do like, express it in the same
Oh,
way. Your
totally.
journey is your own, and it could be if it's just writing and the only place that knows what your real thoughts are is the paper and the pen, if that's the only place where that is, and that's
Exactly. You don't have to
fine. That's
publish it.
nothing. Yeah, you don't have to publish it like you did. So, share with us that process of choosing to publish this memoir, and what was that like? It's only because it's only been less than 3 years,
It
but
has been, but
so by the time
I
you probably had, released this, but,
but
yeah,
see, the
how was
book was
it?
written and completed and agented and sold to the publisher before Dahlia died. And it's not a book about Dahlia's death.
It's
It's
about
really
her.
a book about Dahlia's life. And so, yes, I had to go in and write the epilogue, but it was something that I did for a couple of years at her bedside when she was, when her disease was progressing quite a bit. So that's about how that progressed.
Okay, so it was you were so you were writing already as even you were talking of even just processing her
Exactly.
illness. That was already
That
the
was
way
a
you were
huge
doing it.
thing for me.
Huge. Mhm. Because then you were putting it. Now, how's the aspect of community with other people that have you found a community with other people that their children also have Murph's syndrome? You said you've spoken on
Yeah.
panels before and things like that. So have you created a community around that?
So, not with Murph syndrome. Murph is so rare. So, there's 2 in a million people are diagnosed with Murph syndrome. So, it's not something that I have other people. But I will say that I think that when people are looking for community, it's less about like sharing the exact same disease and more people who are going through it, whatever it is, but people who understand that, in our case, people living on the precipice, people with really intense medical situations, and then, of course, grief. But I haven't sought community deliberately, but I've met people along the way who have become close, and it's just interesting how you immediately get each other, whether that's, again, people who are in the complex medical situations and then in grief. You just connect, you could just speak at a different level right from the start.
It's kinda like what you said with your friends from a long time that you just already can kind of start from that
Yes,
aspect. Here, the same. Like, you already start with the point of relatability of something that
100%.
somebody else knows that your life has completely changed, that you shift, the way you do things because of this condition. So, of whatever condition it is that that person's living. So, yeah, you already have a point of
Speak the same
commonality.
language.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, I noticed that that happens in different aspects of our life. It could happen with, like, religious aspects. So, like, "Oh, okay, I don't have to explain this area of my life. They will
Right,
get if I do this, they'll get this." They'll get it. Or if it's cultural, like, of wherever you grew up, like, if I meet somebody from Colombia, then I don't have to explain my little nuances or my slang that I use in
right.
Spanish, which I still have to do with other Spanish speaking people from
Yes.
other countries. I still have to explain some of the slang, and they have to explain some of the slang to me because it means completely something different in my country. For example,
Right.
my son. so I get that. Okay, so as we are closing off, please share with us how can people get in touch with you. You said you're going to do a TED Talk. When is that
Oh,
going
well,
to air?
probably by the time this airs, that will
Yes.
happen because it's happening in October.
Oh,
But I first of all invite everybody to get breathtaking, which you can get
yes.
wherever you get books on Amazon or bookshop.org or Barnes and Noble. And I'd love for people to connect by getting my weekly newsletter where I talk about all kinds of things related to what I'm working on. So, whether that's guests who are on the podcast or my writing. Also, I always am giving book recommendations because I'm such an avid reader. And you can find me at jessicafeinstories.com. That's Jessica Fein, F like Frank, EIN. And my podcast is I Don't Know How You Do It. And I'm on social, Instagram, Facebook, primarily. And so all the ways, but go to jessicafeinstories.com and that's kind of the hub.
The hub to be able to link to everything else. Jessica, is there anything else you want to share with the audience that I did not ask you that
No,
you
you've
would
been
like?
so lovely. And this has been such a great conversation. Thank you.
I am so grateful that you came here, shared not only your life, but Dahlia's life and your sister and your mom and your dad, your other sister. It's honoring their lives as well as we continue to tell stories. That's also how their life and their legacy continues to live on and impacting other people's lives. So thank you, Jessica.
Thank you.
Thank you again so much for choosing to listen today. I hope that you can take away a few nuggets from today's episode that can bring you comfort in your times of grief. If so, it would mean so much to me if you would rate and comment on this episode. And if you feel inspired in some way to share it with someone who may need to hear this, please do so. Also, if you or someone you know has a story of grief and gratitude that should be shared so that others can be inspired as well, please reach out to me. And thanks once again for tuning in to Grief, Gratitude, and the Gray in Between podcast. Have a beautiful day.